Wel, croeso cynnes I bawb. Hoffwn ddiolch I bob un ohonoch chi am ymuno â ni heddiw yma, am be dwi'n siŵr fydd yn ddigwyddiad gwych. A warm welcome to everyone, and what I'm sure is going to be an absolutely excellent event. I'm not going to say much about today's subject because I know he's going to be well covered by our speakers. But just a few words about Race Council Cymru and why we're co-hosting this event. RCC is an umbrella body representing over 150 grassroots minority communities across Wales. We work with statutory agencies on issues such as hate crime, racism and diversity. And we also deliver the largest number of cultural events in Wales with ethnic minorities through our Black History Wales 365 initiative. We are committed to sharing learning about the history of the diverse peoples of Wales and to recognising and celebrating the talent and expertise of people both inside and outside of traditional educational environments in sharing their knowledge at events such as this. Now, a brief word of thanks before we start. I've thanked you all for joining us today, but many thanks to the Institute for the Study of Welsh Estates at Bangor University for co-hosting this event with us, and Dr. Sean Evans will be speaking to us shortly. Thanks also to the Arts Council of Wales for supporting this event, and to Andy Pike, our Zoom guy, who will be keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes. And again, just a reminder, if those not speaking can keep their mics and cameras off, please. And many thanks to all the people who've worked so hard in promoting this event. We've had several requests from people asking if it's being recorded because they aren't able to make this time, and we're pleased to say we will be able to offer that afterwards. But more than anything, of course, I would like to thank our speakers who from the very beginning showed such enthusiasm and such commitment in joining us today. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd. Over to you, Sean.
Diolch, Marion. Bore da pawb, a croeso cynnes iawn I chi gyd. Thanks very much for joining us this morning for what promises to be a fantastic and engaging event about Jonas Stumplin's life and his legacy. As Marion mentioned, I'm from the Institute for the Study of Welsh Estates at Bangor University, and we're a research centre which seeks to understand the history and the culture and the landscape of Wales, and the role and the influence of landed estates and country houses within those histories. And I think the perspective that we're going to hear today, Jonas Stumplin, is going to be an important one for understanding those histories too. And we're delighted to be partnering with Race Council Cymru for this event. To run you through the programme quickly, we've got 4 fantastic speakers, and the talks are going to be a mix of commentary on Jonas Stumplin's life and his experience and the historical context, together with creative reflections and responses on the continuing relevance and significance of him into the present day too. Each talk's going to be about 20 minutes, and we're going to break after 2 talks for a quick coffee break, and then at the end of all 4 talks, Marion's going to chair a question and answer session. So if you have any questions or comments or feedback that you'd like to provide, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to offer those. Also, if you'd like to follow the event on Twitter, please use the Jonas Stumplin hashtag for any questions and comments, and I'll try and collate those for Marion for the question and answer session too. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Zara Zaidi. Zara is a lawyer, activist, and the founder of the We Too Built Britain, which tells the stories of underrepresented people in Britain with the aim of building social connections and to show what we all have in common. And Zara also campaigns for greater inclusion in heritage and art. So I'm very pleased to introduce and to welcome Zara Zaidi as our first speaker. Croeso, Zara, welcome.
Diolch yn fawr, bore da. I used to, I lived in Carmarthen Natalie, you and I have something in common already, apart from Jonas Thumplin, and left at 16. So my Welsh is a bit rusty, although I was very proud of getting a B in my GCSE. So maybe I'll practice a bit today. So it's a real honor to be here today. I know how much work's gone in. I've spoken to Dr. Marion at length about today. In a way, I'm very much the warm-up act to set the scene, as it were, partly because we've got an active campaign where we've tried to raise the history, the story of Jonas Thumplin in the national profile. So as Sean mentioned, I'm the founder of a campaign called We Too Built Britain. That's all about telling the stories of underrepresented people across the United Kingdom. And we really try and focus on the nations. Because as I'll tell you later, there's often a bias, not only towards England, but towards the capital, the southeast, obviously because that's traditionally the seat of power. And we really want to cast a spotlight, not only on, if you like, heroes who achieved a great deal for their communities, but those who mattered nonetheless for certain achievements or landmarks. And, you know, the story of John Thumplin certainly falls into both, actually, but certainly the latter. And why do we do that? Well, we want to build social connections and show what we have in common, as well as campaigning for greater inclusion in things like heritage and art. Now, you know, there's some traditions, some cultures that have storytelling at the very base of them. I think from my time in Wales, you know, this is sort of oral histories, songs. You know, this is quite important to the national identity, and so these stories really matter in terms of who the community cherished and who the community honoured. And Jonas Thumplin's story certainly falls part of this. And we were active 2 years before Black Lives Matter, the protest after George Floyd, but afterwards, a lot of diversity programs came up, and we felt that rather than focus on diversity programs that looked at targets or bullet points that some people away from your underrepresented group couldn't understand, you could use storytelling and symbolism and the power of representation to make those connections. And remember, when we're talking about these people, we're talking about personal as well as community nominations. There's real power in who people decide to cherish. There's a real identity to communities. You don't have to be, you know, in a statue in Pall Mall for a community to necessarily, you know, have passed the memory of you down through the generations. So why did Marion and Sean invite me to speak to you today? Well, I wrote an article on Jonas Thumplin for Horticulture Week, as you do, that got a lot of traction, particularly beyond those in Wales who knew of his story. How did it come about? Well, in all the post-Black Lives Matter debates around diversity in horticulture, I had realized that absolutely no article had been written talking about the historical gardening figures of ethnic minority heritage to connect people from those backgrounds to their own heritage in those spheres. You know, there were plenty of names that people could have picked or chosen. And I immediately thought of writing about Jonas Thumplin, obviously known for being a gardener, the first known recorded Black person in North Wales. But also this was during the pandemic. And when you think about what people think of being national identity, Britain, as it were, is a nation of gardeners, and gardening had provided so much solace during the isolation and anxiety of lockdown. So I thought, and my team thought, you know, why not build more bridges? Why not tell the story of someone who, you know, who has so many of the qualities that I'm going to outline? So as I said, I grew up in Carmarthen, until I was 16. And it wasn't the most ethnically diverse place. I had the best time of my life, but I was acutely aware of my own diversity, and I had to teach myself about wider history of my heritage, and role models, whether that be my own origins, my family's origins, or indeed those people who'd made a home and a life in Wales. For me, obviously, that was South Wales, but it was so important as a young child who looks different, who, when my family first immigrated, sounded different. It took me a year to learn Welsh. And as a young child, I can't tell you how much stories like John's mattered. And not only that, the love and respect in which he was held, you knew that you had that place. So it always stayed with me. 15 years on or so in England, I'm writing about him. And the fact that John O'Sullivan was Welsh really mattered to me. And you're going to hear from a lot others about how they feel so directly inspired by John O'Sullivan, partly because of his background, or perhaps they work in horticulture. But what I will say is all our nations, all of them, deserve their heroes and trailblazers to be widely known throughout the UK. And as an aside, We Trouble Britain, one of our first campaigns was to get the first ethnic minority face on British legal tender. It went from the Bank of England £50 note to now coins. We've got the first coin, diversity coin. There's a long way to go. But what amazes me is that I don't think we've had the first Welsh figure on a banknote. And so we really need to tell our stories beyond the dominant mainstream, whatever that dominant mainstream is. And so I don't profess to be someone working in this field. I don't profess to be someone actively living in Wales. But that is why our campaign really reveres his story and is so honoured to be here. So I don't want to labour on too much about a story that you probably all know, but I was asked to talk a little bit about his origins. So who was John and why does the story matter? So at We Trouble Britain, we believe, Sean said that we also talk about heritage. We believe that we've got to be comfortable speaking about all aspects of British history. We can learn from it. And as you are all aware, the Welsh Government has been going through a heritage review around statues, around street names. There's going to be new statues of ethnic minority figures. That is so important. But what I find quite revealing and quite inspiring and quite educational about the story of John O'Sullivan is that it did begin as one of trauma and separation, and no story, no history, oral history, or raising up of him being the first recorded black person in North Wales or the first interracial marriage should omit this difficult beginning, because that, first of all, might have been replicated by others at the time. It tells the story of other links that Britain had and how people came here and what their journeys were and what their life when they settled were. And what I would say is, we're lucky that there was a portrait done of John O'Sullivan. We're lucky that we have a few oral histories, but there might be others that we've lost along the way. And so, that cherishing of our heroes really matters. And thank God, whoever decided to memorialize him, as a young man. And the other point around the sort of difficult histories is that we've seen how difficult it is to approach issues around decolonization or colonization or the history of historic estates, as Sean looks at. And sometimes, my day job, I'm a consultant, working on sort of solving social problems, essentially. And you always think about the lens by which the majority of people will understand an issue and be able to tackle it. And with John O'Sullivan's story, you can bridge the issue of colonialism or slavery. You can bridge the legacy of our historic estates. You can bridge the story of the ordinary man and how the first ethnic minority people settled and made a life in North Wales in a way that you can't necessarily do for all people. And I think that's really because he was cherished by, he wasn't someone who's necessarily famous, but he was cherished by the community, and that community made sure that his story passed down. So as I said, he was brought to the United Kingdom sometime around 1746. He was abducted as an 8-year-old boy from possibly Sierra Leone in Africa, although the headstone at his grave does speak about the Indies. And then he was brought to Ynys Canhairan in Gwynedd, North Wales. He was then sent to the Ysyllen estate in Cricieth on a ship as a gift to the Wynn family of Plas Ysyllen. And we know that he was baptized at one of the local churches there. Now, he seemed to be treated, certainly not as of that time, brought over on a ship. He was treated as a servant in the house, and he worked predominantly as a gardener. And whatever you say about how John Ysyllen ended up being part of the Wynn's household, they did treat him as one of staff. And it was quite evident that they discovered he was skilled in crafts and floristry and was able to learn English as well as Welsh very, very quickly. And then, as I mentioned before, around 1754, when he was about 16, a portrait was painted by an unidentified artist. And that really, it's on the invite today, that really has stayed with people. It's a beautiful image. It's very dignified. And that dignity in representation is quite important, because when you show people, who was the first Black person in North Wales, who was this gardener, for example, that you all raise up, look how beautiful that image is. There's a lot of courage and a lot of depth and respect in that portrait. He could have been, put it this way, he could have been illustrated in a number of ways. And then I guess what really captures the heart of nations, or the nation, is that in that house, John Ysyllen found love with Margaret Gruffydd, a maid, and she subsequently worked at Cricieth. And they courted in secret until John absconded from Ysyllen, and the couple were married around 1768. They found work elsewhere, but eventually they were reconciled with the Wynn family, and they were given a cottage with a significant garden called Anharian in recognition of his service. And John died in 1791, and he's buried in the churchyard at Ynys Canhairan, or adjoining the church where his family had worshipped. And John and Margaret, importantly, had 7 children, 2 of which died when they were very young. And his descendants resided in the area for a generation. And indeed, his son, we're talking about historic estates, was a huntsman at the Glenlefon estate. So the story, what I loved about the story of John and Margaret is that it survived and grew, and it was passed down almost as a testament to resilience and enduring love against racial and class barriers. It's certainly one of the first, if not the first, record of a mixed race marriage in Wales. And a few more thoughts on why this really matters. We do need stories not just of politicians and businessmen and philanthropists. Often they're recorded, say, in our statutes, but often that's because they are wealthy, they are of privilege. We don't know if at the time there was a pool of local people done and they were the people wanted on their statues. We need stories of ordinary people who were extraordinary for their circumstances and extraordinary to their community. And the only way forward in such divisive times, and we really do live in divisive times, is to build empathy and to inspire each other and to inspire ourselves of who our heroes are and what our own histories are, our local history. And as I wrote in my article, like John and Margaret, we are all romantics in the end. And you know, when I read a Booker Prize nominated novel, Washington Black, by S.E. Ejugan, and that story always reminded me of John O'Sumplin's story. It's heartbreaking. Washington Black tells a story of a slave who was so gifted in science and painting that in another life he could have succeeded to the fullest of his potential. There could be no belonging, the quote says, for a creature such as myself anywhere. A black boy with scientific turn of mind and a talent on canvas, running, always running from the dimmest of shadows. And that's a beautiful quote from that book. And this is why storytelling really matters on race equality. Because just have a think about that and then link it to John O'Sumplin's story. How many in Wales, or indeed the United Kingdom, were like a fictional Washington Black or John O'Sumplin? Because we know that John was so talented. We know that he became bilingual. He probably still understood the language of his forefathers. We know that he was talented in practically anything to do in craftsmanship, gardening, floristry. What could he have become? And when we talk about it, and his story is quite good also to make the link between the past and today. Stories we've moved on as a society, but stories of inequality still exist. Stories of people being held back to achieve their fullest potential. And some have, you know, that will to live, to create a life, to love, like John O'Sumplin. Others may not. And we need to almost use his story to provide, you know, ourselves with a bit of a roadmap on what's possible, and to not forget these stories, and not to forget these great, the great potential that we have in our nation. And by nation, by the way, here I'm talking about Wales, you know, because it's important for Welsh identity, and important for Welsh identity within the story of colonization or slavery, to deal with its, you know, its own rich heritage, which becomes very specific because of, for example, John O'Sumplen is probably one of the first recorded people of ethnic minority heritage who spoke Welsh. You know, that's really important. Now, I would say that the story of John O'Sumplen is ripe for historical fiction reimagining. We've had so many, you know, we've got a Mary Seacole film coming out. We've got a Noor Inayat Khan film, TV series coming out. We've got a Sophia Dilip Singh mini-series coming out. We've had a Mary Anning films, you know, come out, including of, you know, a potential love affair that she had, by all accounts. Why not the story of John and Margaret? And you know what? It could either be in English or the Welsh language. And really, you know, I would love to see that happen. Certainly the 1971 biography by Robert Jones Isaac needs a modern update. That biography has been invaluable in giving us a lot of facts, but it's of its time. And it would be great to see how someone inspired by his story can really give it color and life and love. Now, I'm going to finish off soon, but someone asked me if we took Britain, we have a campaign for more statues across the United Kingdom called Hidden Heroes. I was asked whether I would push for a statue of John O'Sumplen. My answer was to be reticent and to refer to the local community and to raise up how they have honoured his memory. So I referred people to the website of the Friends of the Friendless Churches, who look after the churchyard at Ynys Canhairen, where, you know, obviously that he's buried. Augment that work that happened against the odds. Somehow, it's beautiful that we've had this story survive the ages. Augment the local area, have people visit it, because he's so important to Welsh history. So I didn't push a separate statue. Now, I also knew that the Welsh government was having its own diversity review, and maybe there's a sort of major statue, you know, in the work. But at his, you know, gravestone, you know, there is a small memorial of sorts. You know, that, to me, that is the pilgrimage to do if you want to soak up the environment in which this man made a life for himself in North Wales. I also told people, to write to their Senedd representative, or put a nomination forward to the Welsh Government's Diversity Heritage Review, or speak to their local MP about making sure that in all this national Welsh and local conversations about who our personal and national heroes are, that his name is there, and we allow for the complexity, as you will hear today, of how he matters to people. And I'm going to emphasize this, because when I'm seeing the lists of, the top 100 Britons or the top 100 this, there often is a bias from the centre, from London South East. You will see, someone in the north of England might not find that enough of their heroes are represented, so they have their own lists. And it's really important that we cherish and raise up these people from our nations, because we are all a product of our environment. We have our origin story. We also are shaped by the landscape, the community in which we brought up and lived. So Jonas Thumplin is a Welsh story. It's a beautiful story of how he found a life in North Wales, and he was accepted by that community, and he was loved, and his family stayed on in the area. So it's for us, and I'm afraid, to often do that hard work, to nominate, raise up our stories, our heroes. I don't care if they're famous. I don't care if they're just important to your street. That's why our Hidden Heroes campaign just asks for people to nominate who is important to them. Our vision for what we think of our nation and how inclusive it is matters to tell these stories, because it will inspire someone, a kid like me, who was searching for her identity, who didn't know, quite where I fitted in, when I did have racism, when I did struggle with the Welsh language early on, when I started to understand my religion, of my parent, of my family's background, and I didn't see people who looked like me. And it's really important that we take charge and we raise these people up, because there are opportunities now, particularly for the Welsh Government's review, to raise, to have these people memorialised and honoured even more. And my God, they should be. Now, what we did do, and it's a long road ahead, but we did launch a campaign in that article that I wrote in Horticultural Week for a rose for Jonas Thumplin. When I was asked to do an article looking at diversity in horticulture, and I thought about, should I frame this within let's have a statue, I wanted to leave the issue of memorialization in a heritage monument to the local area. But what I did think is that gardening, horticulture should celebrate this. And then I was shocked to discover that there'd never been a rose named after an ethnic minority person launched in the UK. And when you think about the history of empire or colonialism, a lot of our flora and fauna comes from other parts of the world. And once again, Jonas Thumplin would provide us a lens by which to see another history, this time the history of how we have our beautiful gardens and where that flora and fauna comes from. And and also why it was adopted and embraced by people in the UK, despite perhaps being from a completely other geography. So that's a campaign that we're hoping to be successful on, and we've got other things planned for Black History Month. But what I will say is that if we are successful in anything, if we do anything, Dr. Marion Gwynn and Liz Saville-Roberts know that I will be in the local area launching something as soon as we actually have some success. Because as today you will find that when you think of the memory of Jonas Thumplin, there's an incredible amount of care and respect and pride in how we talk about and celebrate this incredible human being. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was just fantastic. The background, its relevance, and let's just think for a moment about the John Thumplin Rose and the impact that will have on gardeners everywhere. that is so sweet. Bouquets. That just blows my mind. That is such a powerful symbol, far more powerful than perhaps a statue could ever be.
Well, we have a long way to go on that, but that certainly
I do
is.
understand.
Yeah.
I do understand. But thank you so much. Now, mae'n bleser mawr i mi rŵan I cyflwyno Natalie Jones. Now, Natalie was born in Birmingham to the parents of the Windrush generation of Jamaica. Her family moved to Pwllheli when she was just 9 years old, so just a year older than Jonas Dimllin was when he moved to the very same area. She holds a BSc in psychology and a master's in clinical psychology. Natalie appears regularly on Welsh media where her opinion on race, diversity and education are regularly sought. She is a regular presenter on S4C programmes such as Pnawn Da, and indeed we did a piece together for Pnawn Da on Jonas Dimllin last October as part of Black History Month. And along with this, she has recently trained as a teacher at University of Wales Trinity St David's, and she's just started her first teaching job at a primary school in Carmarthenshire, where she has responsibility for promoting the Welsh language throughout the school. She and her husband, Kerry Jones, are raising their family in Carmarthenshire. Now, we were originally going to film Natalie on site, on the various places that were important to Jonas Dimllin's life, but sadly we weren't able to do this. And it's lovely to see that we have Omala Matamai, very gifted videographer joining us today, but he would have been the one filming Natalie as we went around. Now, sadly, that doesn't come about. And for another reason, I'm really sad, but an extra star award to Natalie today, because she actually has laryngitis. And so she is going to very bravely attempt to speak to us today. Diolch yn fawr, Natalie. Drosodd I chi rwan.
Diolch I chi, Dr. Marian Gwyn, a croeso I pawb. Welcome to everybody. It was lovely to hear from Zara there, and so I apologise if I'm going to be repeating some of the things that she shared with us today, but I would like to put some visuals to what Zara mentioned. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and share the PowerPoint with you, which didn't come up on the oh, sorry. I thought it would come up in my actual oh, sorry guys, I'm not very as tech savvy as I should be, and I thought that my presentation would come up on here, which it hasn't.
Natalie, if you click on the PowerPoint icon, I think it will open it up on the screen.
PowerPoint icon, that one
at the bottom. Yeah.
This is the wrong PowerPoint. So
if you open the PowerPoint that links to your talk, it should.
Oh, perhaps I have to close it again first. I'm so sorry, I'm wasting time.
Don't worry,
now.
We've got lots of time.
Right. Okay. There we are. Can everybody see that?
Brilliant, Natalie.
Okay. So I've called this presentation Jonas Dimllin and Me, because as Sarah said, you know, I feel a strong connection towards him because of not just the colour of our skin, but possible culture and experiences. So you all know the background already. Jonas Dimllin has kind of been put on the history map because of being one of the first people of colour to be documented as living in Wales between 1687 and 1814. So there's only about 30 Black people who lived in Wales at that time that are documented, and it seems he's the only one who lived in North Wales. You know the history already about him being sold into slavery and then given as a gift, and then the gorgeous portrait of him at 16 years old. And I'm in agreement as well that it's so lovely, that it's such a beautiful portrait. It's not a caricature. It's not some sort of minstrel making fun of him. It is beautiful. It's dignified, and it gives us just that beautiful visual of what he looked like, what this young man who was fancied by a lot of local girls looked like when he was going around the area. Now we know he was a gifted gardener, and that he was noted for his skill, and the Wynn family appreciated that. What people probably don't know is how many similarities that I have to him. I was about the same age moving to North Wales. We both lived and worked in and around Criccieth. He married a Welsh girl, I've married a Welsh boy. And I think, we shouldn't underestimate what that was like for Margaret Griffiths to marry the only black man that people of her generation and era would have seen. She would have had to share in some of the challenges he faced as a black man. And certainly my husband, although we don't live in Criccieth now and we live in South Wales, I know that my husband has struggled at times when he's heard people make ignorant or even racist comments, even when he's not with me and he's heard those comments. Those have had an impact on him and his emotions that sometimes people don't think about. And just like Jonas Dimlin, we're raising mixed race children in Wales. And I also learnt to speak English and Welsh just as Jonas Dimlin did. But I'd like to go into a bit more depth about John. For example, we know he had the memory of being taken away from his mother, being kidnapped by white men. And he said he'd been playing alongside a river in a wooded area. And unfortunately, he never saw his mother again. And his last memory of her was of her screaming and running after them, trying to get him back. Coming from a psychology background, I can't help but think that trauma must have been with him for his entire life. These sort of traumas, they can induce PTSD, they can affect your memory, they give you a sense of anxiety, guilt, depression, anger. John would never have had the chance to recover from this trauma because he would never have been reunited with his family. This is somewhere where obviously I don't have that commonality with John. I moved to Wales with my family and my stepfather, who was Welsh. And the weird thing is, I always remember my Welsh father, saying that he knew there was a black man that had lived in Criccieth, but he could never find out much detail about him and always wanted to know more. But so when I was growing up, Jonas Dimlin was an obscure phantom to me, unfortunately, and I wish I'd have known what I know now. I've been thinking about what it must have felt like to be Jonas Dimlin, and he must have felt confusion. In fact, we know he felt confusion because he talked about people asking him what colour his blood would have been. And I also, believe it or not, in this century or last century, was asked similar questions. And I would be confused about, why do people think that's okay to ask? And why do people think that's a question they need to ask? So I can relate to him on that level. He must have felt lonely at times. Even his own wife would not always have understood what it was to be the only black person in that area and the only black person that some people had ever seen. There were times when he suffered humiliation through being impersonated. It would have been annoyance, and there's no doubt he would have suffered separation anxiety. On some level, I know that I suffered from that. Because from up to the age of 8, 9, I was raised alongside children in school who were from Vietnam, Africa, the West Indies, India, Pakistan, and we all had our little differences, which were celebrated and not seen as weird. Whereas when I moved to North Wales, suddenly there were times when I almost felt like a circus attraction. And that's with TV and books. You know, imagine Jonathan Llyn being the only representation of a Black person. So those are kind of the negative side of things. But then it warms my heart to think that he was respected, that people recognised he had talent, that he was skillful. He found love and had children. He would have been loved by his family. And I like to think that the Wynne family also loved him. He would have developed a sense of achievement and pride in his work, and there was certainly acceptance within the community. And so that would have raised his self-esteem, and his gardening, his skill would have given him a sense of purpose, which I think is amazing. And these are all things that I too have developed over the years. And the more I meet other people and the older I get, the more I feel these positive emotions too, that I think Jonathan Llyn would have really developed as he got older too. So how does the story end? Well, it's already been touched on. Apparently he died only aged 46. That's a year older than I am now. And when I saw this plaque, I had to touch it and feel close to him, because he is an inspiration to me. The fact that he had the resilience to have quality of life and to not let the trauma that he'd suffered as a child define who he was, I think is amazing. It's wonderful that we say near the end of his life, but of course he was not an old man then, but in recognition for his service, Ellis Wynne gave him a cottage with a large ancient large ancient garden. So I do think the Wynne family loved him. I mean, that's no small gift to give somebody, and I'm grateful to this family from Cricket, this Welsh family, for not treating him like some of my ancestors in Jamaica would have been, who suffered torture, who were worked to death, who were treated less than human. His life was completely different to that. He wore smart clothes. He had his own home. And when he died, he was buried, and we know where he was buried, maybe not the exact spot, but we know the exact cemetery. And his wife went on to live for 40 years after him. So we know that's how his life ended. But what does that mean today? Well, the legacy, of course, is that they do have descendants who still live in the area. Their son Richard, as we know, served as a huntsman for the Baron of Newborough, who was part of the Wynne family in Glynllifon for 58 years. And a small coincidence is that I've been married twice. When I married the first time, age 19, it was outside the front of this building where this very photo is taken that I had my wedding photos. I have no idea why I wanted to take my wedding photos in Glynllifon, other than I thought it was a beautiful building. At the time, I had no idea that Jonathan Llyn's son had lived and worked here too. So I find that a real fascinating coincidence. We know that some of his descendants moved abroad, but I believe that some descendants still live in the Cricket area and are part of the Moncrief family and part of a family that own a hair salon in the area. And I would love to meet some of those descendants one day. It's something that I haven't had the privilege of yet. Also, Jonathan Llyn's legacy mean that we are still fascinated with his story. S4C, as already been mentioned, has been looking at making programmes about people like him. Historical articles are being written about him. and were written about him back in his own day. So that legacy is being kept alive. And in terms of tribute, I don't know if any of you have been able to visit this pub in Carnarvon in North Wales, but what a wonderful tribute the Black Boy Inn in Carnarvon is to him. Now, of course, there is more than one theory about how the pub got its name. It could have been from a black boy in the sea. It may be that the original name had nothing to do with John Stimson at all. And some people have even taken offence at the fact that it's called the Black Boy Inn. But myself, I think it's wonderful modern tribute. The current owner of the pub clearly considers the link to be an honour, and he is constantly trying to find out more about John Stimson's life. The name is not used in any way to be insulting, and I think it's keeping his memory alive. This is one of the oldest pubs in Europe as well, so I think this is something to celebrate, and the more we can find out about people like him who lived in Wales, the better. I mean, I wish that growing up I had known what I know now about John Stimson, and I'm glad that my children have the opportunity to know about John Stimson and his descendants. So thank you for listening, and yes, any questions? Perhaps I can answer them by typing the answers rather than trying to speak. Thank you.
Oh, Natalie, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much. We are having a question and answer session at the end. I'm rarely short of words, but I feel so deeply moved. There's very little I can say other than that I can't think of a better reason why events like this are just so important. In engaging people with why the past matters, it's why the past isn't the past, and why it is so relevant to our modern day. And Natalie, thank you so much for enduring until the end with your voice. It was evident that you were struggling. We've had two extremely powerful talks now that not only provide the background to the John Stimson story, but provide the relevance to the modern day, bringing all the positive stories, but also highlighting as well the problems and the issues that endure. And hopefully events like this will hopefully inspire people to do more about how we tackle these issues. We are going to now have a 10-minute break. You can stretch your legs, grab a coffee, and so we shall see you all back, please, for another, what I know is going to be an excellent second session. See you at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd. who is going to be our last speaker, has very, very kindly agreed to move her talk now. So thank you all very much for joining us for the second half of what is proving to be an absolutely exceptional event exploring the life and impact of John Stimson. And I'd like to introduce now Audrey West, our next speaker. Audrey moved from North London to North Wales in November 2017 to build on her creative interests, including offering wellbeing retreats. To Audrey, this area of outstanding beauty evokes memories of her birthplace within the Portland, Jamaica landscape, where she left as a child in the 1960s as a member of the Windrush generation. Audrey took her first degree in Iberian and Latin American studies before qualifying as a PGCE modern languages teacher. She received a postgraduate professional diploma in psychosynthesis, as a psychosynthesis counsellor and psychotherapist in 1998, and her MA in cultural memory in 2002. These latter studies raised her awareness of the post-generational trauma in descendants of enslaved Africans who had suffered the onslaughts of the transatlantic chattel slave industry. Audrey has worked extensively with the not-for-profit sector across the UK, focusing on personal, organisational and community development through training and consultancy. As a consultant, she has delivered a range of projects exploring race, trauma, cultural memory and practice through the creative arts, many of these in Wales. Audrey, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this session, Marion. I am still very moved at the talk of the previous speakers, and hope to be able to catch my breath as I was due to go last. So thanks, Marion, for your introduction, and I'll go straight in. I have prepared my talk, and let's just do it. So I'm so grateful to our previous speakers for providing such a rich and colourful background to the portrait of John Stimson. Marion asked me to talk about the portrait, and I hope people had a chance to see it. When I was at school, my art teacher insisted do the background first, when I was keen to get on with the foreground topic of the painting. I might not follow this tradition, but it can help to show the subject in full relief. My own background could also throw some light on the subject. Marion has already introduced me in some way. I came to London from Jamaica when I was 6 in the harsh winter of 1962. And thankfully, I arrived with 5 siblings to join our parents who were already resident in the UK. That was supposed to be temporary, but as we know, 5 years becomes a long time. We were compelled to leave back home as our lives were threatened. Earlier that year, most of us had survived suspicious food poisoning. Through this calamity, my younger sister was called to heaven. We had come to England. We adjusted and got used to the nonsense of racism. We basked in the kindness of strangers, got on with school, family, and church. The stupid names hurt, but Sir, one of our teachers, told us to say, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never harm me." And we fought some of our battles and we kept them quiet and we didn't tell our parents, we just got on with it. Early on in that dark winter, I understood there would be no light again. And just when we thought there'd be no flowers or leaves that grew on the witchy arms of fingers of English trees, green leaves began to sparkle in a cold sunlight. I'd seen winter snow and trapped sheep in my Jamaican reading books, but spring was a welcome unknown. I looked forward to changing seasons, but I almost missed home, that is back home, Jamaica. And I moved to North Wales in the harsh winter of 2017. I feel at home here. I enjoyed learning as a child. I loved the rhythm and mystery of languages. I loved literature. I liked the freedom of painting and drawing. I wondered what it was like to see the world through someone else's eyes. I had the natural curiosity of a child. I was conscious of life and death. These interests set me on the path of a linguist, artist, poet, and as a middle child, a mediator. I qualified to be a teacher, a psychotherapist, and later took an MA in cultural memory. And I could tell you more about my background, but one of the things I maintain was that according to my mum's culture, I'm a Khan from an Khan background. And what I'm sort of recognizing is that there might be some similarities in all the Jamaican contribution today, whether we share, and I'm curious about sharing the synchronicity with John's life, in terms of his own background of the West Coast of Africa. And also, let's just have a look now. I hope Marion would show a picture of his portrait alongside my talk, but let's see how we get on if you've got it in mind. So John's portrait was completed in 1754, and Black people were unusual residents in North Wales at that time, as already stated, almost as now. I mean, people still think, say, where do I come from? And hardly are used to seeing somebody in this part of Wales. Somebody, that is, somebody with colourful skin or whatever you might want to call it. Britain was gaining wealth through trade with Africans for enslaved labour at the time, and Wales was supplying material goods towards a trade, but had less visible involvement with West Indian plantations. 30 years later, by the time of John's death in 1786, the slave trade and sugar plantations in Jamaica were UK's main source of wealth. Yet slavery was being contested by abolitionists and freedom fighters at home and abroad for various reasons. You will have already heard some of the stories of John's origins, and I believe his own narrative has variously reported that he was captured from his African birthplace as he was trying to catch a waterfowl and was put on a ship. That ship would have taken him to Jamaica, I imagine, and on the third stretch of the triangle, he would have been taken with a few other boys to be servants in the UK. John was said to be about 7 or 8 when he was snatched from home. By this time, he would have been a helpful boy to his community and smallholding, up at dawn to attend livestock, fetch water for the farm and family, tend to growth and harvest, play music with friends and family, receive love and support from parents and family, and at nightfall, share stories. All of these activities are familiar to me as a small child growing up in Jamaica, actually. Now, this young boy, estranged, arrived in Crickhurst, North Wales, perhaps as a gift to the Wynne family of the Stumflin estate. He had experienced the trauma of being kidnapped, bound and trapped in the hold of stinking ships, arriving at about 4 different global ports within a year, and separated forever from his birth family. And Natalie has spoken at length about the impact of trauma. Yet John had the good fortune to escape the torment of chattel slavery in the Caribbean that fattened the wealth of the burgeoning British Empire around the time of his capture. When he first came to the Wynne family, he had no language other than the sounds similar to the howling of a dog, says Robert Isaac Jones, his biographer. He was possibly trying to communicate his distress in the West African language he knew. Local women taught him to speak and write English and Welsh. I imagine the maids and children initially treated him as a new pet and were delighted when he could regale them with the language they used and shared with him. Soon, this pet settled down, just a strange black thing to the ignorant. A boy with black skin once you got used to seeing him. Just another boy once you got to know him. A skillful gardener, a talented musician, a quick wit once you knew him well. Age 16, a fine young man ready to go a-courting is what the young ladies around him may have thought. The Stumflin family were proud of their skilled and wise young gardener and commissioned his portrait in honour of his 16th year, we understand. The artist took the trouble to make a painting that could be reproduced as a miniature, possibly a calling card, I think. The artist vividly wrote the name John Stimplin, carefully dated 11th of May, 1754. No one should forget this outstanding person. The artist remains anonymous. The Museum of Cardiff notes that there would have been few opportunities for artists to shine in 18th century Wales. Only a few patrons existed. A black manservant was a rare treasure in Europe at the time, whilst they were made to be brutes in the process of making sugar in the West Indies. This painting may have been a way of documenting this property with visual proof to illustrate the wealth of the owner, as well as honouring the young man. I wonder about the status of the artist. Women were also skilled artisans in Wales at the time. The profile shows a handsome, kind, and finely proportioned figure with a soft brown colouring of a black man, unexposed regularly to hot sun. Could this have been the work of an admirer? Our earlier speakers have mentioned would have mentioned other historical gardeners. And I'm going to talk about Hans Sloane, whose statue was erected in Chelsea in 1733 and recently renewed. And that's also a contested statue. Now, Hans Sloane purchased the manor of Chelsea and established Chelsea Physic Garden there. And we know a little of his personal qualities and a lot more about his wealth. So Hans Sloane came to wealth by cataloguing the botanical and medicinal skills of enslaved African people, a Khan from the coast of West Africa during his career in Jamaica that began in 1687 as he was a physician to the Duke of Albemarle, the colony's new governor. Sloane profited from owning a sugar plantation in Jamaica worked by enslaved people. That was the inheritance of his wife, Elizabeth Langley Rose. Most people have heard of Sloane Square and the British Museum, a small part of Sloane's wealth and legacies from his trade. I've visited the Sloane Chelsea Physic, and it's one of my favourite places, but I've always wanted to expose both Sloane and his compatriot who, I forget his name, who did the taxonomy of race, because I think both those people have really thrived on so many misdemeanors, for want of a better word. I'm not sure where I stand with statues, because I think we need to keep some memory of people who have not behaved well in history, but I'll leave that as a ... Now, back to John, he would have been baptized as a Christian to save his pagan soul from hell, I imagine. He was adopted into a Welsh family and culture, and therefore couldn't keep his primitive Khan name. He kept his dignity and soul, however, as well as the horticultural and farming skills that might have been instilled in him as a child. He was rewarded with self-esteem and integrity, and he maintained those qualities. And he would also have entertained people with his quick wit. Two maids wondered out loud if that man's blood is like the blood of white men. John's immediate retort on overhearing this was, "Silly fool, you kill a black hen and a white hen and you'll see the blood of both of them is red." He was musical and devout until the end. On his deathbed, a neighbour said John's main regret was that he played the crwth on Sundays. An honest man with integrity and moral strength, good with his hands, a green-fingered black man, a talented musician and dancer. By the time this painting was made, local women were fighting over him. We know a bit more from previous speakers about how he fell in love with the maid Margaret Griffith, who was initially fearful of him as a black man. She saw his outstanding qualities as she got to know him better when she brought him meals. They fell in love. Against all the obstacles, they married. 14 years after this portrait was made in 1768. They were a contented couple producing 7 children, and the rest is history. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Audrey, on yet again another powerful and relevant one. And to me, what stands out is the Hans Sloane story. He went and took another part of an enslaved person's life, their knowledge, took it, used it, and was enriched in another form from the backs of Black people. Thank you so much indeed for that. Now, I just want to check, is our final speaker on? I don't think he's been able to sort out his technical difficulties. It might be worthwhile, useful to us now, if we go, if it's all right with our speakers. Now, before we do anything else, could we just unmute our mics and just applaud our speakers for the quality and depth and insight of the amazing talks that we've had this morning? If we could just applaud them, please. I think that was just amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Such talent that we've been able to bring to the table today, to today's event. Now, what I'd like to do now is to open the floor, if it's all right with our speakers, to our question and answer session. And just checking to see, I still don't see Gareth on, so it looks as if he hasn't been able to join us. I know he was with us at the beginning. Right, so any points that people would like to raise with our speakers, please? I mean, there's so many that I could ask. I think what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, if you could put questions either in the chat box, or I think if you want to put your hand up, if you want to, Audrey, you want to ask a question, please ask a question.
Marion, it was Carl Linnaeus I was trying to remember.
Oh, Linnaeus, yes, absolutely.
Yes,
yes, absolutely. Yes, defined everybody. And plants, of course. Now, can I ask Natalie if Natalie has a voice left, please?
Yes,
what I thought was so powerful when you were talking about the Black Boy Inn, because you know I believe that the name doesn't come from Jack Stimplin, but can I say how powerful your explanation was about why it's important that he should be connected with that name, because it is a form of memorialization. Could you just expand on that point again, please? Because that really had impact on me.
Yes, of course. If you've ever met the owner, he's so enthusiastic about memorialising Welsh people in general inside the pub. There are tributes to of the young girl that walked for miles to Bala to get a Bible, or from Bala, you know, and different people like her. So his whole sort of, the pub has become a shrine to people who are important in Welsh history, and for him, it's important that the name remains as a tribute to John Stimplin, and I really like that. You know, again, for me, growing up feeling the odd one out quite a lot, it would have been nice to know when I was in my 20s and I'd been in the Black Boy Inn, that it was actually a tribute to somebody Black who had lived in Criccieth. I would have felt less alone and less alienated from other people, from other Welsh people as well. So yeah, I think it's, for me, that's what's become important. That's what I like about that name. It's not, because recently a pub was forced to change its name in England, wasn't it, which was also called the Black Boy. So yeah, for me, it's not an insulting title by any means, but rather keeping that history alive. And John is keen to have, you know, he's got the portrait of John Stimplin in the main area in the pub as well. So he's not just doing it as a novelty name, the Black Boy Inn. He actually is educating people about John Stimplin's life when they go in that pub.
Now, that is an excellent answer, Natalie, because it leads on to our next question, which is from Liz Saville Roberts. She asks, how do we embed Jonas Dymchllyn's history into the national curriculum of Wales? I think we'll have this as an open question to everybody. Natalie's just answered. I know as a teacher you have very strong opinions on this, but perhaps Audrey or Sarah would like to comment on this before Natalie comes in.
I'm happy to deal with that.
Sarah, thank you.
I think first of all, it's about respecting what the Welsh government's doing, and then seeing what the follow-up is on that in terms of, you know, storytelling, moralization. But certainly, I think I remember when I was studying history in secondary school, Welsh history was part of that. And certainly, I think there is a space for it, and you know, it's not only a history of ethnic minorities, it's our collective history. And I think that's really important to note, and I think it's essential. And Marian, you made a very good statement of, this isn't about the past, this is the past connecting the present and actually our journey together. And people often think that, you know, diverse Britain wasn't as diverse long ago. Actually, you know, this was a trading nation empire. Even in Roman times, you know, there was a lot of diversity. The Tudor court, for example, you know, so I think it does need to be part of a sort of history module in school, or a sort of, you know, a lot of our disciplines are really expanding now. So, for example, when, you know, I used to love art. You know, when you talk about art in the context of community, you know, it's to get young people inspired by having a community art module. You know, it's really important. And I think it's really important for, you know, you don't live in Wales without knowing that there's quite distinct identities within North and South, and his story just really matters to North Wales. Without plugging another event and another sort of another program, I was very honored to take part in something called Respect Due by the Museum of Colour, and I can put a link in the chat. And what I think is really powerful about John's story is that it was saved not because he was deemed to be, you know, a so-called you know, hero of the British government, or a big philanthropist, or a politician, the kind of people we see in statues. But his story was really, it was passed down almost by the local community, cherished by the local community. And what I would like to see, in addition to what the Welsh government's doing on statues and heritage, is something like this Museum of Colour, or, you know, or to contact them, Marian, and say, you know, how could we be inspired by you and work with you? Because what they asked almost 20 of us to do from different backgrounds is to nominate someone who was important to Britain, but to us individually, and why that mattered individually and for their achievement. And I'm just going to find on Twitter the picture of the person I nominated. So I nominated a painter called Maisalun Faraj, who basically saved Iraqi art during the Second Iraq War, and all her work talks about celebrating both her background, but also building bridges between East and West. And when I nominated her, it was important to me, but the layering of a people's project, it was like an experience, an education, a community baptism of fire. Because first I nominated this person. I told them I was nominating them. They were honored. Then the organizers contacted them, and the organizers didn't know, you know, all of them didn't know about her story. Then they had a painter paint her portrait, and they had a series of interviews, which are all going to be online, not yet. So I'm going to just put the tweet in of this so you can see into the chat. And then I was invited so that you had this whole, so you had almost 20 of us nominating people, not knowing who the other people were nominating. And then the lead up to the event, I've put the portrait in the lead up to the event. The organizers would post a quote from either one of us or the actual nominees. And it created this collective consciousness of beauty, of respect, of achievement. But then to go to the launch event on Thursday, so 2 days ago, at Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, it was something beyond emotional. And I really would recommend that to my Welsh friends on the call today, because I looked around the portraits, I lingered. You know, I'm really inspired by how Audrey talked about the importance of these images. But I read the stories and I read the quotes. This wasn't, you know, when we look at historical figures, we see their, you know, and if we don't know them, all we do is we see their name. Oh, okay, he was a politician. Oh, okay, he was a painter. But emotional connections really matter. And it became this sort of spiritual experience where I was seeing this sort of patchwork of Britain. And then they asked me to give an interview on why my saloon mattered to me. And suddenly, you know, this layering brought home how important this person is to you for their art and their community, but also to the fabric of the nation. So if I had one recommendation beyond what's typically told about, you know, said about these things, it would be something like that. And guess what? No pressure, but we have Natalie and we have Audrey. We could easily do something like that. So Liz, is that a decent enough answer? I know I could talk for Wales, let alone England. But, you know, I just wanted to share that event with you all, and we could do something here.
Thank you very much indeed for that very comprehensive reply. Now, I'd just like to say thank you to Gareth Evans-Jones for having torn across North Wales when he suffered technical difficulties. I'd just like to make a point on Liz's question now in relation to curriculum. And then if it is all right with our speakers, and we'll break off from the Q&A session to allow Gareth to give his presentation, and then we'll finish off Q&As afterwards. Just very quickly on the Welsh curriculum point, I was lucky enough to be invited by the Welsh Government to sit on the panel for the national curriculum. The themes and experiences of minority communities in Wales in the new curriculum. What was so important about this was that it wasn't focusing specifically on Black history, of it being part of a history module continuously, but that it should be embedded and threaded through every single subject, including the STEM subjects. And of course, what you have with John Stimplin is that you have him as a gardener, very important there. You've got biology, you can bring in so many things there. And I think the excellent point that Audrey raised about the Chelsea physic, where Hans Sloane took that knowledge from West Africa that had reached its way to the Caribbean. And so one thing that particularly interests me throughout history is transference of knowledge, transference of experience. And these are subjects that can thread their way through every single element of the curriculum, whether it's humanities or the sciences. Now, thank you for joining us for the first part of Q&A. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to go straight to Dr. Gareth Evans-Jones. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sean Evans, first of all, to introduce Gareth before his speech. Thank you very much indeed.
Diolch, Marion. Croeso, Gareth. Glad you're able to join us. Yeah, everyone, I'm delighted to introduce my Bangor University colleague, Dr. Gareth Evans-Jones. Gareth is a lecturer in religious studies in the School of History, Law and Social Sciences at Prifysgol Bangor. And he has wide-ranging research interests. And earlier on, Zara talked about bridging and how Jonas Stumchlin can be used to bridge different contexts and spheres and questions and so forth. And I'm hoping that we're going to get this in Gareth's talk, because his research interests include literature and society, the history of slavery and ethics, Welsh nonconformism, and 19th century print culture. So I'm hoping that in Gareth's talk today, we're going to get some connections and links between those and the life and the biography and the memory of John Stimplin. Gareth was also awarded the drama medal at the recent National Eisteddfod too. So I'm delighted he's here to speak to us today. Croeso, Gareth, welcome. Feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Bore da bawb, good morning. Apologies to begin with, technical difficulties. My laptop has been on its last legs for a while, and today was the end day, I think. It's decided that's it. So after this session, I'll be going to buy a new laptop this afternoon. So apologies for that, but thank you very much for allowing me to present now. So hopefully you can all see this PowerPoint which says John Stimplin, Chronicle Alltid Eifion, the Chronicle of Alltid Eifion. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank you so much to Marianne and Sean for this opportunity to present on John Stimplin, who has been a significant figure, as we've heard from the fantastic talks this morning. He is such a significant figure in our history, and he is a character that I've had a fond interest in his life and times for a while. So it is excellent to have this opportunity to discuss John Stimplin. So I'm going to focus primarily on the chronicle, on the biography of Alltid Eifion that was published in the 19th century. And I open with a quote from Simon Brooks. John Stimplin was not the only black Welsh speaker in the countryside of Wales in the 18th century. He is, however, the most famous, primarily due to Alltid Eifion's having published a small pamphlet about him. And we see that quote in Simon Brooks' recent publication, Hanes Cymru, Lleiafrifoedd Ethnig ar Gwereiddiad Cymraeg. And as Brooks suggests, the chronicle published by Alltid Eifion was a highly significant piece of work. Now, the pamphlet in question, and I offer a translation of the title here, John Stimplin, or Jack Black, the story of his life and tales about him from the time he was brought uncivilized from Africa until his death, his descendants, etc., and a picture of him in 1754. Now, this was written by Robert Isaac Jones, or Alltid Eifion, to give his bardic name, and it will be by his bardic name that I'll be referring to Jones. And Jones, or Alltid Eifion, was a pharmacist, an author, and a printer from Tyddiniolyn, Pentrefélin by Porthmadog. Now, Alltid Eifion had an added advantage at his disposal because he lived among the stories of John Stimplin that were passed through generations worth of oral tradition. However, it should be noted that the work in question was published in 1888, about 102 years after the death of John Stimplin. So, important questions regarding the accuracy of the facts noted, they do arise. Indeed, as we will see, there were various conflicting stories about certain aspects of John's life. Having said this, the pamphlet is very important, as it is an account of the history of one of the earliest known black people in Northwest Wales. It also testifies to the response of the country people of Northwest Wales to the appearance of John Stimplin, a black man, and indeed exemplifies a type of racist attitude of the chronicler himself, a seemingly racist attitude that was rather common among the Northwest Walians of the time. Now, the pamphlet opens with a foreword by Alltid Eifion, which explains his reasons for creating a biography about John Stimplin. Now, what is striking is the terminology in which he uses to refer to this individual who was brought from Africa, according to all probabilities, to Wales. This individual who was, and I quote, one of the descendants of Ham, end quote. Now, this is a biblical reference to one of the sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. According to the biblical account, the planet was repopulated after the great flood of Genesis by the three sons of Noah. And according to one tradition, the descendants of Ham were thought to be the African people. Now, it's also interesting to note that a tradition developed over the centuries of connecting the person of Ham with the curse of slavery. Now, in the 9th chapter of Genesis, we see Noah cursing Canaan, the son of Ham, to be a servant of servants to his brothers, i.e., a slave, and a slave to the descendants of Shem and Japheth. Even though it is Canaan who is named, an erroneous belief developed that led people to surmise that Ham had been affected by the curse of slavery. And it was agreed that since the descendants of Ham were the people of Africa, then that nation had inherited this curse, and so were destined to a life of servitude. Now, this argument, the so-called curse of Ham, was highly influential in condoning the activities of colonizers and slave owners to conquer people and subdue others to slavery. Now, this turn of phrase that Alltyd Eifion uses is significant, especially when we read in the Chronicle one narrative of John Stimplin being kidnapped from Africa and taken to Wales, possibly, as we've heard earlier, as a slave. And I quote Simon Brooks again, that narrative, that story of him being kidnapped was the one that was reiterated most often, as it suggested a Welsh connection with the most awful crime of slavery, that being stealing people from Africa. Now, at the start of the pamphlet, we see three stories about, and I quote, the arrival of the black boy at Ystumllyn. And we heard earlier about the black boy in Caernarfon, so interesting to see that connection. Because there is no certainty which of the family brought John Stimplin to Wales. The first story Alltyd Eifion had heard, that being from his own mother, was that a member of the Ystumllyn family, and I quote, caught the boy in an African jungle and brought him home with him to Ystumllyn, end quote. It was thought that he, oh, there we are. There we are, there's the quotes. There we are. And where I'm supposed to be now. Now, it was thought that John was about 8 years old at the time, and he was later baptized in either Criceth or Ynys Cynhaearn. Now, in this account, we perhaps see an example of stealing an African boy and displacing him against his will in accordance with the activities of the Atlantic slave trade. Even worse, it could be argued, was the fact that the boy was christened John. He was, in a sense, instigated to adopt a new and completely different identity to the one that he had back in Africa. Now, it could be argued that the ignorance of the Welsh people of the African culture is also shown with Alltyd Eifion's comment that the boy, and I quote, spoke no proper language. He could only utter dog-like howls and screams, end quote. It is probable that the boy spoke one of the many African dialects, but as the Welsh people did not know and arguably did not make the effort to learn about the varied linguistic breadth of Africa in the 18th century, it was declared that John Stimplin was an uncivilized person without language. According to a second story, John Stimplin is discussed as if he is a thing rather than a person. Now, it is said that he had arrived in London with a number of other, and I quote, black boys, end quote, and that Ellis Wynne of Stimplin's sister, Mary, who resided in London at the time, had sent the boy, and I quote, to her brother as a gift, end quote. John was considered to be nothing more than a present, could be argued a thing. Mary, we know, had married a man called William Hollier, possibly the same Hollier as the one who was secretary of the African Merchants Company, an important company in the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century, especially around the Gold Coast of Africa. So we possibly see here a direct link between human trafficking and the gentry. The third version of the early life of John Stimplin is an account of his own telling, stating that he had been caught by white men whilst he was, and I quote, trying to catch a moor hen beside a small stream in the woods, end quote. With this, he remembers clearly how his mother ran after the men and John, and I quote, uttering the most horrible of cries, end quote. Now, Alli Davion favoured the first of these three versions of the accounts, the one he heard from his own mother. But in actuality, the three versions are as important as each other. Why? Because they convey a situation whereby an African, could be argued, was taken from his homeland and planted into 18th century northwest Wales. However, if one remembers the line, "Yn Indian gynnam ganwyd," in India I was born, in the englyn on John Stimplin's gravestone, the work of David Sean Shams, perhaps one could suggest that the boy came from the West Indies rather than Africa. But obviously there is no way of telling for certain. There needs to be much more research. Now, the subsequent comments of Alli Davion regarding how the new boy was treated are interesting. And I quote, "It took them, the people of Northwest Wales, a long time to civilize him, and during this time he was not allowed out," end quote. John is depicted similarly to that of an animal, a pet, who needs to become docile, who needs to be broken in and kept indoors. Indeed, this reflects the racialistic viewpoints of the time, that a black person was inherently ignorant and uncivilized and needed to be subjugated, needed to be made civilized. However, it is said that John learned Welsh and English, that he became a masterful gardener and a skilled craftsman, and that he was employed by the Stimplin household. He also became a topic of curiosity to many in the area. I quote, "Even though his skin was black, the local maidens used to dote on him and would compete for his favours," end quote, says Alli Davion. In the end, it was Margaret Griffith who won John's affections. In this regard, the chronicle discusses a love story between the two when John visited Margaret in Criccieth one night, where she was a maid, and how the man of the house responded when he saw John. I quote, "To his surprise, he, the man of the house, saw something black in the form of a man. He had such a fright that he rushed away and convinced his wife that he had seen a black C-TH-L in the kitchen." Now, on the one hand, this is a light-hearted story of courting and its trials, but it is also highly multifaceted. We see here a derogatory attitude that some harboured towards John Stinllin, Black Jack, especially with the reference of him being a black C-TH-L. Now it's probable that this stands for Black Cythrail, meaning black devil. If so, this conveys the characteristic attitude of the time whereby some were scared and suspicious of black people, and whilst others were of the predominant opinion that the black people needed to be subdued as they were, indeed, black devils. Now, Margaret subsequently moved to work in Dolgellau for the wife of a minister who was her aunt, and John ran away from Stinllin. Again, this is an interesting turn of phrase, the fact that he ran away. Does that suggest that John was kept in a particular type of service to the Stinllin family, so much so that he felt that he needed to run away? Or was that just a turn of romantic phrase that he ran away from service in order to be with his loved one? Again, it could be interpreted in different ways. With this, John lost his job, but he married Margaret around 1768. They went on to have 7 children, but 2 of them died in their infancy. The other children, however, succeeded to lead meaningful lives, even though they probably experienced some prejudice due to their being of mixed race. Now, John appears to have been re-employed by the Stinllin family, and towards the end of his life, he and Margaret went to live in a place called Nhyrra Isa, which had a great garden, one that would have excited John Stinllin's horticultural aspect. And this place was given to John and Margaret by the Stinllin family. Now that suggests that there existed a good relationship between the employers and the employee up until the very end. Now it's stated that John died from jaundice when he was 46 in July 1786. However, Alltydavion does acknowledge that John's gravestone reads July 1791. Margaret later passed away in 1828 at the age of 81 years old. Now, in the final pages of the pamphlet, we read, and I quote, "some amusing incidents about John Stinllin," end quote, which offer a commentary on the character and nature of the man. It is discussed how the people of the time had, and I quote, "very peculiar notions about coloured people," end quote, because of how uncommon they were to the white Northwest Walians of the 18th century. With this in mind, Alltydavion tells a story of a discussion between 2 maidens as they shared their theories regarding whether the blood of John Stinllin would be the same colour as a white person's. Now it is noted also how, and I quote, "local children were terrified," end quote, "of John Stinllin, but that they had no reason to be, because he was," and I quote, "extremely honest, truthful, and without malice, and was respected by all classes of people," end quote. It is further noted that he was a very moral man too. Now it's possible that this is a joyous statement of the character of John Stinllin, this black man who was able to signify characteristics that countered preconceptions about black people, especially among this Northwest Walian white community. Now the chronicle draws to a close with a story recited by one Ellis Owen of Cefn Meysydd about Margaret, John Stinllin's wife, in the May Day Penmorfa fair when she was with her child, Richard, who was 2 years old. And this is quite a lengthy quote. "When the child, Richard, recognized his father in the crowd, he called him by name. His mother boasted to her friends how bright the boy was to recognize his father amongst so many people, not realizing how conspicuous his colored father was amongst white people. As the old Welsh proverb goes, gwyn y gwel y fran ei chiw, the crow sees its young as white. Now, on the one hand, this is a dear account of a 2-year-old child seeing his father and becoming excited by that. But on the other, it could be argued, it offers a keen commentary on the racial ideas of the time. The boy could recognize his father because of the colour of his skin. In the middle of the sea of white faces, John's face would have been obvious. But the use of the verb, the crow sees its young as white, at the end of the pamphlet includes a suggestion of a racist undertone, that white is the dear colour, the correct colour possibly. The crow does not see its young as black, but as white, perfect, clean, pure. These are suggestive by the term white. Now, of course, white is a symbolic colour in the Christian tradition, and so was an integral part of the mind of the believers of the time. But one can't help but feel that there is an idealizing of the colour white, and possibly a semi-suggestion that John Stimlin, or Jack Black, who became a Welsh-speaking African, was nearly as white in character and nature as the local white Northwest Walian population of the time. He was as white as them, apart from the colour of his skin. Now that is a major question, a major thing to suggest, and it's full of possible arguments and possible debates and discussions that need to be held and could be discussed even further. But I'm aware of the time constraints, so I won't go into further detail with this suggestion or this possibility, but I'm more than happy to discuss it further at another time. However, to conclude, this chronicle is indeed very important. It includes information about the life of that significant figure, John Stimlin, and shows how he was integrated into the Welsh society of the 18th century. The chronicle is, however, abundant with inconsistencies, with 3 stories about the arrival of John Stimlin to Wales, and includes racist tones regarding the story of the integration of a black man into Welsh society, that he had to be tamed initially, that children and adults alike were scared of him, and that he was unfamiliarly exotic to the women of the area. Having said this, Alludeifion demonstrates how John Stimlin became a notable Welsh African in North Wales, and how one of his children succeeded in leading a prosperous career, that being Richard, in spite of his being of mixed race. The biography is very important and is an interesting account of an individual who has come to be known as the most famous Welsh African of 18th century Northwest Wales. And it's excellent that today's event has taken place to commemorate John Stimlin and to celebrate his contribution to the life and culture and history of Wales. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for listening. And I hope this has given you a brief overview of Alludeifion biography, a very important work on the life and times of John Ystymllyn. Thank you.
Gareth, I can't. Diolch yn fawr I chi. Oedd hynna'n gwych. Now, I would just like to say to everybody that we had offered Gareth and Natalie the opportunities to deliver their presentations in Welsh, but due to an error on my part in setting up the link, I hadn't set that facility up before we had distributed the link, and we cannot do it retrospectively. So many thanks to both Gareth and Natalie for offering to do their presentations in English, although hopefully next time we'll be able to have that facility set up beforehand. Now, I know we've already done this, but Gareth wasn't there then. Could we please just unmute and offer our 4 speakers a round of applause, please, for their just tremendous presentations this morning. Thank you. Diolch. Thank you. Now,
Marion, you've muted.
I've just muted myself, haven't I? Yes. We're going to go on for a brief question and answer session again, so that Gareth can be a part of that. But I would just like to say the way that you took apart that pamphlet was absolutely masterful. It was just so important, and in the context of what we're talking about today, just so relevant. So yes, and a comment from Zara here, just blown away by this talk, as I think we all were, and the way that it just provided the context for everything that our other 3 speakers have been speaking about was just absolutely perfect. Thank you. Any points, any questions that people would like to raise? Sean, you normally like to ask questions. What would you like? What points would you like to raise?
Well, I was just wondering, listening to Gareth's talk, then, do we have any indication from the biography as to why it was decided to put it together and to write it? Presumably, there was a feeling that there'd be a readership for this, or was it more about preserving the legacy of this interesting and as other speakers have said, sort of treasured figure in the locality? Is there any sense of that, Gareth?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sean. It is interesting. I do think the suggestion you get from it is that John Ystymllyn was viewed as a very important figure locally, and there were many different traditions, there were many stories, and obviously, Davion says he was aware of stories that he'd heard from his mother and other people in the area about John Ystymllyn. So I think he did feel that there was an audience for him, and he was still viewed as a significant figure, and quite, I can imagine, quite an exotic figure, quite an interesting, a mystical figure in a sense, really. And I think that was one of the main motivations for Davion to decide we need to preserve his legacy, we need to preserve his story, because he is an example of one of the earliest known Black people in Northwest Wales, and obviously one of the, especially in North Wales in its entirety, really. So I think it was just to preserve his legacy mainly. So yeah, thank you for that question.
And can I just add, because also that it's round about the same time as the abolitionist movement as well, isn't it?
Yes.
And so, which was of course started, well, by the time you get to there, I mean, it's post that, but you've got a lot of work being done on Wales and slavery. American slavery was still very strong at that time. And I know Gareth has done a lot of work on publications produced by Welsh people on abolition, so it may well be a part of that. I see Audrey and Zara have raised their hands. Audrey first. Audrey, would you like to ask a question?
I'd like again to thank all the speakers, and I just want to really honour Gareth spelling out racism and the basis of colonialism in such a vivid way around the pamphlet. I wonder, Gareth, whether you think people are aware of this way of profiling Black people, and whether those thoughts have changed over time.
Oh, thank you for that question and that lovely comment, Audrey. I think there definitely needs to be further education. Definitely, we need to. Well, this event is a major step in the right direction. I feel there needs to be more discussions, really, about past conceptions on with regards to people from different nations, different coloured skins, different societies, really. I referred at the beginning of my talk to Simon Brooks' latest publication, Hanes Cymru, which looks at the minorities in Wales, and that is a major contribution, I believe, to start educating people and ensuring people become more aware of past conceptions and past imagery of people from Black people and people from other societies and countries also. But I definitely feel that we do have a duty, we do have a genuine duty to actually disseminate this information about the pamphlet and the other talks as well. I think the all the presentations today have touched upon very important points that need to be discussed further, and they need to be aired in a wider setting, really. So yeah, so thank you for that question.
Thank you. Zara, you have your hand up. What would you like to say?
Hi, Gareth, I'm really just blown away. I mean, I think I'm going to be affected by your talk for weeks, because it was a forensic view and exploration of such a historic pamphlet that we've all read. And we don't have your academic discipline of taking apart and dealing with the unsavory aspects of that. And then you also contextualized it with what could have been the background. So that is just, sort of phenomenal. I guess my question is transferring the knowledge of what you all have done in recording the life and history of John O'Sullivan to actually the rest of the UK and how they deal with local histories, raise them up, how they show the resonance of a community that accepted somebody, centuries ago, and how they deal with these difficult aspects of slavery, of colonialism, of racism, of outdated ways of telling a story in the pamphlet, of difficult aspects of even the family that allowed him to somewhat thrive. And just to give you an example, as someone who's of a Muslim heritage, how historic the fact that John O'Sullivan is recorded is. So dealing with Islamophobia, one thing we tried to do in We Took Over Britain was try and find stories like this of the Lascars, who were the, in the 16th century East India Company, the first, they joined as merchants. And I was sure that I could find records of them as gardeners, and you just don't have that. And I guess my question is, how do you position the story and the telling of it and the recording in this pamphlet in the national psyche, both of Wales and the UK, in terms of hardly anyone has happened to document it this way because of the portrait, because of the pamphlet. And I think there needs to be a national presence and record of how important the community was in doing this. So the question is really about the significance of how this happened, and it's a record of does that sort of make sense? It's so significant when you think about the lack of stories elsewhere. So over to you. Sorry, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you, Sarah. And can I just say, your presentation was fantastic as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, I was blown away with how you were able to just discuss it off so naturally, without need of like a paper like this. You were just so natural. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think when we think about the wider context, there is a lack of stories like John Stimplin, definitely in that time period, and also in today's more contemporary narrative as well. There is a lack of possible narrative regarding Black people in the UK in general, really. So I feel, again, I think I said earlier, we have a duty to preserve these stories, and with that, take in a way take lead with these stories and actually start promoting them and try and ensure that we create a wider discussion around them, really, because at the time when this pamphlet was published in 1888, obviously when we think about the sociological, political, societal, cultural context of the time, we acknowledge that it was during a time after the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. However, obviously John Stimplin was part and parcel of the society during a time when slavery was rife, and I think that those two, how they sit with each other, and the question, I know it's quite a bold question, but to what extent, what exactly was John's status initially with the Stimplin family? Was he just a servant, or was he perhaps a slave in a sense, and was he later emancipated, and as part of that given a house and sustenance in a sense? These are the types of questions that need to be discussed, really, and these are types of questions and points that they offer themselves in Ashley Davion's pamphlet, and we do need to discuss them further. I'm so thankful. So I can't tell you how much to Marianne and Sean for this opportunity to look at the pamphlet again, because I'd read it a couple of years ago when I was starting to do my research into slavery and the response of the Welsh in Wales and in America. But going back to it now, having read more about the area, I'm so inspired, and I feel like I'd like to research this area further. So thank you. I think you've started a new research project for me there. So thank you so much for that, and thank you, Sarah, for that question as well. And again, thank you for your fantastic presentation also.
I think we'll be coming to you, Gareth, in the near future about what you've just been talking about. We have two hands up. One is from Byddig and the other one is from Natalie. So if we go to Byddig first, please. Byddig. If you'd like to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't have a question. It's a statement. It's just, I was brought up in Pentrefellin, and we used to play as children in Ynys Cynhyrn. And I don't think we understood the centuries. It didn't mean anything to us, but we knew Jack Black, and we used to go and play on his grave and all sorts of things. So, and the Hurra was just up the road from where I lived. So in a way, he's ours. He's a Pentrefellin boy. And I just wanted to make that statement. But thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you all. Thank you.
And I think that is such an important point to make, because it shows how much stories like this reach out to everybody and across the generations. To Natalie. Natalie, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, just first of all, beth roedd hynna mor annwyl benedicti nawr. That was lovely. And Gareth, that was so deep, like the depth you went to first to understand Jack Black, as he was called. But Zara's question about how we sort of bring more knowledge and bring Jack Black into modern life, I think matches with what Liz Saville put in the comments earlier. And I don't know if people are aware, but the curriculum in Wales has changed for children, and one of the main themes at the moment is Cynefin, which is our sense of belonging and home. And I think the duty now is on all educators to do some research that when they're talking about Cynefin, it is inclusive, and we're not just looking at white figures or white history, that we remember that Black people, Muslim people, Chinese people are part of the fabric of Cynefin in Wales, and not an afterthought, not something on the side. Jack Ystymllyn for me is a perfect example of somebody you can talk about within the theme of Cynefin, as Byddhig just showed us.
That is such an important point. Does anybody else have any questions? I can't see any hands up. Has anybody, if you have any other questions, do please.
Can I ask a question to Audrey, Marion?
Please do, Sean.
Thank you. Yeah, Audrey, thanks for putting the portrait in context for us. And I think there's so much more research that needs doing on there's sort of a group of portraits, and it seems to become fashionable, certainly from maybe the 17th into the 18th century, for members of the gentry, sometimes alongside their Black servants, and sometimes Black servants depicted by themselves, to feature in portraiture. I know there's a really quite famous example at Erthig near Wrexham too. I just wondered if you have any comments on that sort of broader fashion, and any comments on why that was the case, and what you take from these depictions.
Thanks for that question. It's as I said to Marion, I went on a sort of wild goose chase when I was looking at the portraits, because one of the books I was recently reading is The Black Jacobins, and I was very impressed by this portrait of a Black man, because it showed him in his full power and detail and so on. And some of the portraits that we see of Black people are caricatures around the time of slavery and so on. And I don't know much about John Ystymllyn, and that sent me on a journey to find out more. And I appreciate, as everyone else, the way that this sort of bit of research really has set us on a journey. In a way, as you've said, there are sort of, the Black man is often used, and it's often the Black boy, as a sort of an object, a treasure, it's a thing that you say, I've got this and it's precious. And that's often used in established households and wealthy households to show I can own this thing. And I kind of find it a sort of cultural and cognitive dissonance, because these same Black people were then abused and brutalized abroad, even though they had the same qualities. And so I kind of think, what's going on in people's minds? A bit like, how can you do that to a person? It's a bit, as you say, it's a bit like, for instance, Jack Black was compared to a racehorse. It's like you treat a horse well and then you treat a horse badly. They're both brilliant things. I mean, I'm not saying that, humans are horses, but in terms of how you can have that dissonant way of viewing a person. Sorry, I mean, I will go on, because it's really very hard to stop on this one, because I just think, I don't know how many books have been written and shown the differences, but I was saying to Marion, it really does need a lot more research to look at the figures, because once you start looking at Black men, then you start looking at Black women, then you start looking at enslaved people, at the exoticism of saying they were having a great time out in the plantations and so on. So sorry to carry on, but it really needs a lot more research.
I think that is an excellent point that you've made. You may wish to look up the work of Marcus Wood. I'm not quite sure how recently he's been writing, but certainly around about 2007 and the commemoration, the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. He has written a lot about the use of Black people and the Black body within not only art, but within literature and other forms as well. So I do recommend that people read anything by Marcus. Marcus would. I see Gwilym Owen has his hand up. Gwilym, over to you. Gwilym, would you like to raise a point? I see your hand up. Gwilym, would you like to speak? Do you have a question? Perhaps if you're not able to, could you type the point you'd like to make? Ah, there we go. Okay, thanks, Gwilym. Right, can we hear you? You're actually showing as unmuted. Oh, hang on, you're just... Right, there we go. Oh, sorry, we still can't hear you. You're showing us as unmuted. I don't know why we can't hear you. Is it possible for you to type your question in the chat? I know it can be a pain, very, very so, or type the point you wish to make. In the meantime, we've had a question asking where the portrait is now. The portrait is still in the ownership of the family, and but because it is so well known within the public domain online, it is now acceptable under Creative Commons license to be able to use it. That's why it is used so many times. Do we have any more joy with Gwilym? Do you want to try again unmuting Gwilym? Oh, you're showing us unmuted. We can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Would you like to type something? While we're waiting for Gwilym, I'm so sorry about this. Any other points people would like to raise?
I think it'd be great if we could find a way collectively of making the biography of the Welsh language version and in translation more accessible and available. I think it can be quite challenging to get hold of it, can't it? So I think if there's efforts around that, I think that might be worthwhile.
Well, I think Gareth could perhaps consider doing editing an anthology of papers on it, and can imagine we could have an entire festival based about this. And with Natalie's connections with S4C, then perhaps we could have a film made about him as well. And of course, this feeds into everything that we're trying to do regarding the national curriculum, embedding stories like this into the narrative of Wales. So there's so many different opportunities. Right, oh, hang on. Yes, but Ivor has asked about the video. Yes, the video will be available. It's available on, I think, on Facebook, and also I think Andy Pike has been recording it for us as well. So yes, we will certainly be sharing it. I think the presentations we've had today are far too valuable to be lost. Right, I think we're actually well over our time, but I think it's been well worth us overrunning our time for the quality of the speakers and the quality of the debate that we've had afterwards. Ma hwn wedi bod yn sesiwn ragorol. It's been just an astounding. Oh, there we go. Yes, Dylan Foster Evans has put a link to Ashley Davion's booklet there in the chat section. It has been far more emotional, far more powerful. I knew it would be interesting, but it has exceeded all my expectations regarding the impact of what the speakers could actually come up with. and not only from the discussion, but it is evident from everybody who's joined us today that this is a subject that will have impact well into the future, and I very much look forward to being a part of that. A very quick thank you to everybody, but now for the formal thank you, over to Sean. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd.
Yes, diolch Marion, and just a huge thank you to everyone who's joined the session today. Thanks very much for joining in on what is quite a nice day as well, and a special thank you to the 4 speakers. I mean, those talks were incredibly powerful. And thought-provoking and useful, and I'm sure we'll all go away from today's events with lots to think about, and also, I think importantly, lots of ideas for how we take this forward from now on, both focusing on Jonas Tumchlin and the wider issues too. So please do keep in contact with Race Council Cymru and the Institute for the Study of Welsh Estates. And for those of you on Twitter, I think most of our speakers are on there, and I'm sure they'd appreciate comments and feedback and suggestions and so forth. But yeah, just to conclude, can we thank our speakers once more, and Marion as well for her work in organising the event. And after that, I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend. Diolch yn fawr iawn, bawb. Thank you.